The blood-soaked sunset painted the Montana sky crimson as Zachariah Prescott rode into Green River with nothing but his stallion, his rifle, and enough ghosts to haunt the entire territory. The year was 1876, and the promise of America's westward expansion had drawn thousands to seek their fortunes, but Zach wasn't looking for gold or glory. He was looking for oblivion. The main street was typical of frontier towns that had sprung up across the West after the war. A dusty thoroughfare lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon with piano music spilling into the street, and the persistent smell of horses, gunpowder, and unwashed bodies. Green River had grown from a trading post to a proper settlement as the Northern Pacific Railroad pushed its iron veins across the territory. Zach dismounted outside the livery stable, his movements fluid despite the weariness that had settled into his bones over the years. At 32, he wasn't old, but the life he'd led had carved deep lines around his eyes and streaked his dark hair with premature silver at the temples. "$1 a night for the horse," the stable boy said, eyeing Zach's black duster and the worn Remington holstered at his hip. Zach handed over 2 silver coins. "Feed him good, he's earned it." The stable boy pocketed the money with a nod. "You stayin' long in Green River, mister? Long enough." Zach's voice was low, roughened by trail dust and too much whiskey over the years. He gathered his saddlebags and bedroll, then headed toward the hotel at the far end of the street. Green River wasn't his destination, nowhere was, but he needed work, and railroad towns always had something for a man who knew how to handle himself. A man with his particular skills. The Elkhorn Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its fresh paint and glass windows suggesting prosperity that the rest of the town hadn't quite achieved. Inside, a clerk with spectacles and a neat mustache looked up from his ledger. "Room for the night," Zach said, placing a gold piece on the counter. The clerk slid a key across the polished wood. "Room 12, top of the stairs, end of the hall. Bathhouse is out back if you're interested." Zach nodded his thanks and climbed the creaking staircase to his room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the street below. He dropped his saddlebags on the floor, placed his rifle within easy reach, and sat on the edge of the bed. 6 years since Appomattox. 6 years since he'd laid down arms as a Confederate sharpshooter and started running from what he'd become during those 4 bloody years. The faces of the men he'd killed through his rifle scope haunted his dreams. Boys, some of them. Boys in blue who never saw death coming. After washing trail dust from his face, Zach headed downstairs. If there was work to be found, the saloon would be the place to hear about it. The Frontier Saloon was doing brisk business when Zach pushed through the batwing doors. Miners, cowboys, and railroad workers crowded around tables, the air thick with tobacco smoke and profanity. A piano player hammered out a lively tune in the corner, while soiled doves circulated among the tables, offering companionship at a price. Zach made his way to the bar and ordered whiskey, keeping his back to the wall and his eyes on the room. Old habits died hard. "You're new," the barkeep observed, sliding a glass toward him. "Passing through," Zach replied, tossing back the whiskey in one swallow. It burned satisfyingly down his throat. "Looking for work." "What kind of work?" "Any kind that pays." The barkeep refilled his glass. "Railroads always hiring. Dangerous work, though. Blast crews been hitting trouble in the hills east of here." Zach nodded, filing away the information. Railroad work was hard, but it paid well. The noise in the saloon suddenly dropped, drawing Zach's attention to the door. A woman stood there, tall and straight-backed, dressed plainly but neatly in a dark blue traveling dress. She wasn't a saloon girl. That much was obvious from her bearing and the nervous way she surveyed the room. She was striking rather than beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed too old for her face. Her copper-colored hair was pulled back severely, but tendrils had escaped to frame her face. She couldn't have been more than 25. The piano player faltered, and conversation stalled as every man in the room took notice. A respectable woman alone in a saloon was an unusual sight in Green River. She approached the bar, ignoring the stares. "I need to speak with the proprietor," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement. "That'd be me," the barkeep said. "Frank Wilson, what can I do for you, miss?" "I'm looking for work," she said, her chin held high despite the flush creeping up her neck. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "This ain't that kind of establishment, miss. We got girls who serve drinks and keep the customers happy, but I play piano," she interrupted, gesturing toward the instrument. "And I can sing. I'm not looking for that kind of position." Something about her caught Zach's attention, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the door periodically. She was running from something. He recognized the signs because he'd been doing the same thing for years. Wilson looked skeptical. "My piano man comes cheap, and the boys ain't particular about quality." "Let her play, Frank," called a voice from the back. "Can't be worse than Jennings pounding those keys like he's trying to murder him." A few laughs rippled through the crowd. The piano player, presumably Jennings, scowled but stood up from his bench with exaggerated courtesy. The woman gave a tight smile and made her way to the piano. She sat down, smoothed her skirt, and for a moment simply stared at the keys. Then her fingers descended, and the first notes of "Beautiful Dreamer" filled the saloon. The transformation was immediate. Her rigid posture softened, and her face took on an expression of quiet concentration. Her voice, when she began to sing, was clear and sweet, cutting through the smoky air like sunlight through clouds. Zach found himself staring. It had been a long time since he'd heard anything beautiful. The trail didn't offer much in the way of music, unless you counted coyotes howling at the moon. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the saloon erupted in applause. She acknowledged it with a nod, then turned to Wilson with a questioning look. $3 a week, the barkeep offered, plus meals, got a room upstairs you can use. $5, she countered steadily. "I'll play every night except Sundays." Wilson considered, then nodded. "Start tonight. What's your name?" "Violet," she said after a slight hesitation. "Violet Montgomery." Zach watched her shake hands with Wilson, noting the relief that briefly crossed her face. She played another song, then another. Each one met with approval from the increasingly appreciative crowd. But throughout her performance, he noticed how her gaze kept finding the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it at any moment. Violet Montgomery was definitely running from something. Or someone. Zach finished his whiskey, left coins on the bar, and headed for the door. It wasn't his concern. Everyone in the West had secrets. He had enough of his own to worry about. Outside, the night had deepened, and stars punctured the black canopy overhead. Zach paused to light a cigarette, the match flaring in the darkness. From inside the saloon, Violet's voice carried, now singing a mournful ballad about lost love. Zach was about to turn toward the hotel when movement caught his eye. 3 men on horseback were approaching slowly down the main street, their posture suggesting purpose rather than casual arrival. The lead rider was tall and broad-shouldered, with a distinctive white hat visible even in the dim light from the saloon windows. Something about their deliberate pace raised Zach's hackles. He stepped back into the shadows beside the saloon, his hand instinctively dropping to his Remington. The 3 riders dismounted in front of the hitching post, and the man in the white hat spoke in a low voice to his companions. Then he adjusted his gun belt and headed for the saloon doors. Zach couldn't explain his next move, even to himself. Perhaps it was the hunted look he'd seen in Violet Montgomery's eyes, or perhaps it was simply that he recognized trouble when he saw it. Whatever the reason, he slipped around to the back of the saloon just as a scream pierced the night air. Inside, chaos had erupted. Tables were overturned, and men scrambled to get out of the way as the man in the white hat dragged Violet toward the door by her wrist. Her face was pale with terror. "You're coming home, Vi," the man was saying, his voice carrying the hard edge of authority. "Your father's paid good money to see you returned. Let me go, Edward." She twisted in his grip, her free hand clawing at his face. white hat Edward cursed as her nails raked his cheek. Still a wildcat, I see. That's going to stop once we're married. Zach stepped forward before he could think better of it. The lady doesn't seem interested in going anywhere with you. The saloon fell silent. Edward turned, his hand dropping to his pistol. This isn't your business, stranger. You're disturbing my drinking, Zach replied mildly. That makes it my business. Edward's eyes narrowed as he took in Zach's worn duster and the Remington at his hip. I'm Edward Tanner, and this woman is my fiancée. She's had a spell of confusion. Her father's hired me to bring her home to St. Louis. I am not your fiancée, Violet spat, still struggling, and I'm not confused. I'd rather die than go back. Zach kept his eyes on Tanner. Sounds like the lady's made her choice clear. Tanner's face darkened. Step aside or I'll have my men remove you. Your men are welcome to try. Zach's voice remained casual, but there was steel beneath it. The two men with Tanner now stood just inside the saloon doors. One was young and nervous, fingering his pistol like he wasn't entirely sure how to use it. The other was older, with a scar that pulled one eye into a perpetual squint, and he carried himself like a man who knew his business. Tanner's grip on Violet's wrist tightened, making her wince. Last chance, stranger. What happened next occurred too quickly for most of the onlookers to follow. Tanner went for his gun, but Zach's Remington cleared leather first. The shot cracked through the saloon, and Tanner howled as the bullet tore through his shoulder. His grip on Violet loosened, and she stumbled backward. The scarred man drew next, but Zach was already moving, diving behind an overturned table as bullets splintered the wood around him. Zach fired twice more, one shot catching the scarred man in the chest, the other going wide as the younger man fled through the doors. Silence fell, broken only by Tanner's pained cursing as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. Zach rose slowly, keeping his Remington trained on Tanner. Anyone else feeling heroic tonight? No one moved. The saloon patrons pressed themselves against the walls, and Wilson had ducked behind the bar. Violet stood frozen, her face ashen. You shot him. Just winged him, Zach replied. He'll live to make poor decisions another day. Tanner glared up at him, teeth clenched against pain. You're dead, you son of a bitch. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Zach said quietly. A man who doesn't understand when a woman says no. He turned to Violet. Miss Montgomery, I suggest you gather your things. Green River's about to become unhealthy for both of us. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She nodded once and hurried up the stairs, presumably to the room Wilson had mentioned. The sheriff arrived moments later, a grizzled man with a silver star pinned to his vest and a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. He surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on the dead man and then on Tanner's wounded shoulder. Someone want to tell me what happened here? Self-defense, Zach said simply. This man and his friends drew on me. Several patrons nodded in confirmation. The sheriff sighed heavily. You got a name, Mr. Prescott. Zachariah Prescott. Well, Mr. Prescott, I'm Sheriff Miller, and while I appreciate you not killing this one too, I think you'd better come with me until we sort this out. Zach knew how this worked. In a frontier town, a shooting, even a justified one, meant complications. Tanner had mentioned money, which suggested he might have influence. The sheriff's jail was the last place Zach wanted to be when Tanner's reinforcements arrived. Sheriff, Violet's voice came from the staircase. She had returned with a small carpet bag. Mr. Prescott was defending me. This man, she gestured to Tanner, was attempting to abduct me against my will. Sheriff Miller looked between them, skepticism evident in his weathered face. And you are Violet Montgomery. I was hired tonight as the saloon's piano player. She's lying, Tanner growled, struggling to his feet with the help of one of the patrons. Her name is Violet Mercer. She's the daughter of Horace Mercer of St. Louis. I've been hired to return her to her father. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. Mercer, the railroad baron? Violet's face tightened, but she didn't deny it. My personal affairs are not relevant, Sheriff. This man threatened me and drew his weapon first. Miller scratched his beard thoughtfully. Miss, if your father's looking for you, my father does not own me, Violet said, her voice hard as flint. I am 23 years old and I have chosen to make my own way. There is no law that says I must return to St. Louis if I don't wish to. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. No, there ain't. But if there's a reward, $5,000, Tanner said through gritted teeth, for her safe return. And I'll add another 1,000 for the man who killed Ray and shot me. The atmosphere in the saloon changed instantly. $5,000 was a fortune in the West enough to buy a decent ranch or set up a business. Every man in the room was suddenly looking at Violet with new interest. Zach stepped closer to her, his expression grim. Sheriff, we'll come to your office and make statements. But I think we all know that keeping Miss Montgomery in Green River tonight would be unwise. Sheriff Miller hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but I want both of you at my office at first light. And you, he pointed at Tanner, get that shoulder looked at by Doc Hanson. I'll take your statement after. Outside the saloon, the night had grown colder. Violet hugged her carpetbag to her chest, her breath forming small clouds in the chill air. Thank you, she said quietly, but you shouldn't have involved yourself. Edward Tanner is a dangerous man, and my father is even worse. I've met dangerous men before, Zach replied, guiding her toward the sheriff's office. What's your real story, Miss Mercer? She flinched at the name. Montgomery is my mother's maiden name. I've been using it since I left St. Louis 3 months ago. She glanced up at him. And you, why would you risk your life for a stranger? Zach didn't have a good answer. Perhaps it was the way she played the piano with a passion that reminded him there were still beautiful things in the world. Or perhaps it was simply that he recognized a kindred spirit, someone else trying to outrun their past. Let's just say I don't like bullies, he finally answered. What's in St. Louis that you're running from? Violet's eyes darkened. A cage. My father arranged a marriage to Edward Tanner to secure a business merger. Tanner owns land that my father needs for his railroad expansion. She laughed bitterly. I'm just another asset to be traded. They reached the sheriff's office, a small wooden building with barred windows. Miller was already inside, lighting lamps. Come in, he called. Let's get your statements and figure out what to do with you two. For the next hour, Violet and Zach recounted their versions of what had happened. Miller took notes in a ledger, occasionally asking questions. Finally, he set down his pencil with a sigh. Miss Mercer or Montgomery, if you prefer, I can't force you to go back to your father, but I also can't guarantee your safety in Green River, not with that kind of reward money floating around. He turned to Zach. As for you, Prescott, the shooting looks justified based on witness accounts, but Tanner's not the type to let this go. What are you suggesting, Sheriff? Zach asked. Miller rubbed his face wearily. The morning stage to Helena leaves at dawn. My advice is that both of you be on it. Give Tanner time to cool off and decide if pursuing you is worth another bullet. Violet looked at Zach uncertainly. I have some money saved. I could make my way to California, perhaps. Tanner would follow you, Zach said. Men like that don't give up easily, especially when their pride is wounded. Then what do you suggest? Her voice held a challenge. Zach considered. The smart move would be to part ways with Violet Montgomery or Mercer at the first opportunity. Her troubles weren't his, and he had enough ghosts haunting him without adding her problems to his burden. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the way she had stood up to Tanner, refusing to be intimidated despite her fear. Or perhaps it was simply that he was tired of running alone. I know places where Tanner and your father's money won't find you, he said finally. Places off the main trails. If you're willing to rough it for a while, I can help you disappear. Hope and wariness warred in Violet's expression. Why would you do that for me? Consider it a professional courtesy, Zach replied with a hint of a smile. One fugitive to another. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. I didn't hear that. And I won't ask what you're running from, Prescott. Just do me a favor and get clear of my town before I have real trouble on my hands. They left the sheriff's office with a plan to meet at the livery stables an hour before dawn. Violet would return to the hotel to rest while Zach gathered supplies for their journey. "Can you ride?" he asked as they parted, Violet's chin lifted. "I grew up on my father's estate outside St. Louis." "I've been riding since I was 6, Zach nodded, satisfied. 1 hour before dawn. Pack light, dress warm, and be ready to ride hard. As Violet turned to go, Zach caught her arm. "One more thing, if you're planning to double-cross me or slip away in the night, don't. Tanner will have men watching the stage office and probably the trails out of town. Our best chance is if we stick together." Her eyes met his, steady and clear in the lamplight. "I won't double-cross you, Mr. Prescott. You've risked your life for me once already. I don't forget such debts." With that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Zach to wonder what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The night passed quickly as Zach made preparations. He purchased supplies from a sleepy shopkeeper who didn't ask questions when offered extra for opening after hours. Ammunition, dried beef, coffee, flour, beans, and other necessities were packed into saddlebags. At the livery, he arranged for a sturdy mare for Violet, paying in advance with most of his remaining cash. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Zach was waiting at the stables with both horses saddled and ready. The town was quiet, most of its inhabitants still asleep. But Zach knew that Tanner would have men watching the obvious escape routes. Violet arrived precisely on time, wearing a split riding skirt and a dark wool jacket. Her hair was braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried her carpetbag and a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "You look more practical," Zach observed, taking her bag and securing it to the mare's saddle. "I've learned to be adaptable these past months." She stroked the mare's neck, establishing a quick rapport with the animal. "She's beautiful. Her name's Penny," the stable boy said, emerging from the shadows. "She's gentle but has good endurance." Violet thanked him with a smile that made the boy blush. Zach handed him a coin. "We were never here." The boy nodded solemnly, pocketing the money. "Saw 2 men watching the East Road and the stage office. Nobody at the North Trail yet." "Smart lad," Zach murmured. "North it is, then." They led the horses quietly through the back alleys of Green River until they reached the northern edge of town. As the first golden rays of sunlight crested the eastern hills, they mounted up and set off at a brisk trot, keeping to the tree line for cover. Zach led them north for several miles before cutting west into rougher country. The terrain grew steeper as they left the river valley, forests of pine and aspen replacing the open grasslands. By mid-morning, they had climbed high enough to look back and see Green River in the distance, a collection of tiny buildings nestled along the silver ribbon of the river. "Do you think they're following?" Violet asked, reining in beside him at the overlook. Zach studied the landscape below, his eyes narrowed against the glare. "Not yet, but they will be. Tanner strikes me as the persistent type." "He is," she confirmed grimly. "My father chose him precisely for that quality." Edward Tanner built his fortune by never giving up on what he wants by any means necessary. "What does he want with your father's railroad?" Violet adjusted her hat against the sun. "My father's building a spur line into Montana territory. Tanner owns vast tracts of land with timber and mining rights. Their partnership would make them both even wealthier." Her mouth twisted bitterly. "And I'm the contract seal." Zach nodded. It was an old story women used as bargaining chips in men's business dealings. He'd seen it in Virginia before the war among the plantation aristocracy. "We should keep moving," he said. "There's a place I know, about 3 days' ride from here, an old trapper's cabin in a hidden valley. We can rest there and decide your next move." They continued westward through increasingly rugged country. Zach set a challenging pace, but Violet kept up without complaint. She rode well, as she'd claimed, sitting her horse with the natural ease of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. As the day wore on, Zach found himself stealing glances at his companion. There was more to Violet Mercer than the refined piano player he'd first seen in the saloon. She handled the difficult terrain with determination, her face set in lines of concentration as they navigated steep slopes and rocky passages. Beneath her proper exterior was a core of steel that he couldn't help but admire. By late afternoon, storm clouds were building over the western mountains. Zach found a sheltered spot beside a creek, tucked under an overhang of rock that would provide some protection from the coming rain. "We'll stop here for the night," he announced, dismounting stiffly. The old wound in his thigh, a parting gift from a Union sharpshooter at Chancellorsville, was aching after the long day in the saddle. Violet slid from her horse with a barely suppressed groan. "I haven't ridden that hard since I was 17, she admitted, stretching her back. They worked together to make camp, Zach impressed by Violet's competence. She gathered wood for a small fire while he tended to the horses, then helped him prepare a simple meal of bacon, beans, and coffee. The rain started just as they finished eating, a gentle patter on the leaves that quickly became a steady downpour. They huddled under the rock overhang, the small fire casting dancing shadows on the stone behind them. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Prescott," Violet said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth. "Not much to tell," Zach replied, "and I think you can call me Zach, considering we're fugitives together." A smile flickered across her face. "Zach, then, where are you from originally?" He hesitated. It had been years since he'd spoken of his past to anyone, but there was something about the quiet rain and Violet's steady gaze that loosened his usual reserve. "Virginia. My family had a small tobacco farm in the Shenandoah Valley. Had the war." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Sherman's men burned it during their march. My parents died in the winter that followed. Pneumonia took them both within weeks of each other." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "And you, where did you serve?" Zach's jaw tightened. "Confederate sharpshooters." Under burden. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Confederate sharpshooters were notorious, feared, and hated by Union soldiers for their deadly efficiency. A good marksman could pick off officers at distances of up to half a mile, sowing chaos in enemy ranks. "That explains your skill with a pistol," she observed neutrally. "It's not something I'm proud of," Zach said, staring into the flames. "I was 19 when I enlisted, full of foolish notions about glory and defending the Southern way of life." He laughed without humor. "Turned out I had a talent for killing men from a distance. By the time I realized what I was really fighting for, I had too much blood on my hands to walk away." Violet was quiet for a long moment. "My father made his first fortune selling supplies to the Union Army," she finally said. "He used to boast about charging triple the usual prices because they had no choice but to pay. He called it patriotic capitalism." The rain intensified, drumming on the ground beyond their shelter. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains. "How did you end up in Montana?" Violet asked. "Kept moving west after the war, worked as a ranch hand in Texas, drove cattle to Kansas, scouted for the Army against the Sioux." Zach's voice was flat. "Tried to outrun what I'd done, I suppose. And did it work?" He met her eyes across the fire. "No, some things you can't outrun." Violet nodded slowly. "My mother died when I was 16. After that, my father saw me only as an asset to be deployed for his benefit. When he announced my engagement to Edward last winter without even consulting me." She trailed off. "I realized I was nothing more than property to him. So I took my mother's jewelry, sold it in Chicago, and kept moving west." "Brave," Zach commented. She shook her head. "Desperate. I'd watched my mother wither away in that house, trapped in a loveless marriage. I couldn't face the same fate." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the storm passed overhead. Eventually, Violet unrolled her bedding on one side of the fire while Zach took the other. Despite their exhaustion, sleep came slowly. Zach lay awake, listening to the rain and the occasional shifting of the horses tethered nearby. Across the dying fire, he could see Violet's profile in the faint light, her breathing now deep and regular. He wondered what she dreamed about, perhaps the fine house in St. Louis she'd fled, or the freedom she was fighting so hard to keep. Zach finally drifted off to the sound of the rain, his hand resting on his Remington beside him. His last conscious thought was that, for the first time in years, he wasn't sleeping completely alone. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night. They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and coffee, then resumed their journey westward. The rain had washed the world clean, and the mountain forests glistened in the morning light. Violet seemed different today, more relaxed in his company, perhaps. She rode beside him when the trail allowed, pointing out wildflowers she recognized and asking questions about the landmarks they passed. Her curiosity was refreshing after years of riding with taciturn men who spoke only when necessary. Around midday, Zach's vigilance was rewarded when he spotted movement on a distant ridge. "Riders," he said quietly, reining in. "3 of them following our trail." Violet's hand went to her throat. "Tanner, likely." Zach studied the terrain ahead. "There's a creek about 2 miles west. We'll cross there and try to lose them in the higher country." They pushed their horses harder, descending into a narrow valley where a fast-flowing creek cut through the forest. The water was high from the recent rain, churning and frothing over the rocky stream bed. "We'll cross here," Zach decided, dismounting. "Lead your horse, the current's strong." The crossing was treacherous. Water swirled around their knees, numbing cold even in early summer. Halfway across, Violet's mare balked at the current, nearly pulling her off her feet. "Easy, girl," she murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "You can do this." Zach watched, impressed by her calm handling of the frightened animal. After a moment, the mare steadied and followed Violet to the far bank. Once across, they remounted and climbed steeply away from the creek, following a game trail that wound through dense forest. The going was slow, but the thick woods would make it harder for their pursuers to spot them. "If we can reach the high pass by nightfall, we'll have a good chance of losing them," Zach said. "The trail splits a dozen ways up there." They rode hard through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, they reached the pass, a windswept saddle between 2 towering peaks. From this vantage point, they could see for miles in every direction. "No sign of them," Violet said, scanning the terrain below. "They'll have lost time at the creek," Zach agreed, "but they won't give up. We need to keep moving." They descended the western slope of the pass as darkness fell, following a treacherous trail by moonlight. Finally, when the horses were stumbling with fatigue, Zach called a halt in a small clearing surrounded by pines. They made a cold camp, not risking a fire that might be spotted from above. Dinner was jerky and dried fruit, washed down with water from a nearby spring. "How much farther to this cabin you mentioned?" Violet asked, huddled in her blanket against the night chill. "A day's ride," Zach replied. "Maybe less if we push hard. There's a settlement another day beyond that small trading post where we can resupply." Violet nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "And then what? I can't keep running forever." It was a question Zach had been asking himself since they left Green River. The smart move would be to escort Violet to a larger town, Helena or Virginia City, perhaps where she could lose herself among more people. But even in a city, Tanner's money would eventually find her. "We'll figure something out," he said, not entirely convinced himself. They took turns standing watch that night. During Zach's second shift, as the eastern sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, he heard the distant sound of a branch breaking. He froze, hand going to his rifle. For several minutes, he scanned the surrounding forest, every sense alert. Finally, he caught movement, the flicker of a shadow against the gray pre-dawn light, about 200 yards downslope. Zach moved silently to where Violet slept and placed a hand over her mouth. Her eyes flew open, instantly alert. "They've found us," he whispered, removing his hand. "At least one of them is in the woods below. We need to move." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, not speaking as they saddled the horses and secured their belongings. The sky was brightening by the minute, dawn approaching inexorably. "Stay close to me," Zach murmured as they mounted up. "If there's shooting," Ride hard and don't look back." Violet nodded, her face set with determination. She had tucked her braid up under her hat again and looked more like a young ranch hand than a railroad baron's daughter. They set off at a walk, moving quietly through the trees. Zach led them uphill, away from where he'd spotted the movement, taking a route that would be difficult to follow. The terrain was rugged, forcing them to dismount frequently to lead the horses over rocky sections. By mid-morning, they had covered several miles of difficult country with no sign of pursuit. Zach began to hope they'd lost their trackers, at least temporarily. The hope was short-lived. As they crossed a small meadow, a rifle shot cracked through the air. The bullet kicked up dirt yards ahead of them. "Warning shot," Zach said grimly, drawing his Remington. "They want you alive." 3 riders emerged from the trees at the edge of the meadow. Tanner, his arm in a sling, flanked by 2 hard-faced men with rifles. One was the young man who'd fled the saloon in Green River. The other was a stranger with the weathered look of a professional tracker. "That's far enough, Prescott," Tanner called. "You're outgunned. Hand over the woman and you can ride away." Zach positioned his horse to shield Violet. "Miss Montgomery isn't property to be handed over, Tanner. It's Mercer, not Montgomery," Tanner snapped, "and she has obligations to fulfill." "The only obligation I have is to myself," Violet called, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "Go back to my father and tell him I release him from any promise he made you. Find another way to seal your business dealings." Tanner's face darkened with anger. "Your father has invested too much in our arrangement to simply walk away. Either you return willingly or we'll bring you back by force." Zach assessed their options quickly. They were exposed in the meadow with little cover. A direct confrontation would be foolish. Tanner and his men had the advantage of position and numbers. "There's a ravine about half a mile west," he said quietly to Violet. "When I start shooting, ride for it. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" she whispered. "I'll be right behind you." Zach raised his voice. "Tanner, I have a counter-offer. Take your men and leave." "Forget you ever met Violet Mercer." Tanner laughed. "Or what?" Zach's answer was a rapid succession of shots. He fired twice at the ground in front of the horses, causing them to rear in panic. In the confusion, he wheeled his stallion around. "Ride." He shouted to Violet, spurring his horse forward. They galloped across the meadow, bullets whining overhead as Tanner's men returned fire. Zach twisted in the saddle to fire back, not aiming to hit, but to keep their pursuers at bay. The ravine appeared ahead, a deep cut in the earth with a narrow game trail winding down its side. Violet took it without hesitation, her mare sure-footed on the treacherous slope. Zach followed, sliding and scrambling down the steep incline. At the bottom, the ravine opened into a dense forest of ancient pines. They plunged into the shadows, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. "They won't risk their horses on that descent," Zach said, drawing up beside Violet. "They'll have to go around. It buys us some time." They pushed on through the forest, following a meandering creek that flowed through the heart of the ravine. By late afternoon, the land began to rise again, and they emerged from the trees into a hidden valley nestled between towering cliffs. "There," Zach pointed to a small cabin nestled against the base of the northern cliff. "That's our destination." The cabin was sturdy but weathered, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a stream tumbled down from the cliff face nearby. As they approached, Zach scanned for signs of recent occupation but saw none. The place appeared exactly as he'd left it 2 years earlier. "Whose cabin is this?" Violet asked as they dismounted in front of the small porch. "Belonged to an old trapper named Mackey," Zach explained, untying his saddlebags. "I found him here 3 winters ago, dying of pneumonia, stayed with him until the end. He had no family, so he said the place was mine if I wanted it." Violet looked at him with new understanding. "So you do have a home after all," Zach shrugged, uncomfortable with her perception. "It's just a place to winter sometimes." Inside, the cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed built into one wall. Everything was covered with a layer of dust, but otherwise intact. While Violet tended to the horses in the corral, Zach swept out the cabin and started a fire in the hearth. By the time she returned, he had water heating for coffee and was inventorying the supplies left in the cabin's small pantry. "We have enough to last a week or so," he announced. "After that, we'll need to visit the trading post or hunt." Violet nodded, warming her hands by the fire. In the golden light of the flames, with her hair coming loose from its braid, she looked younger and more vulnerable than she had on the trail. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For everything, you didn't have to help me. Most men wouldn't have." Zach busied himself with the coffee pot, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Seems to me you'd have found a way without me. You're not exactly helpless." A smile touched her lips. "No, but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." She hesitated. "Why did you really help me, Zach? The truth." He considered her question seriously. "When I saw you in that saloon playing the piano, there was something in your eyes, something I recognized." He stared into the fire. "People who are running don't just run from something. They're usually running toward something too, even if they don't know what it is yet." "And what are you running toward?" Her voice was soft in the quiet cabin. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something better than what I left behind, I hope." They fell silent, the crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl the only sounds in the gathering darkness. The next few days established a routine that was almost domestic. Zach hunted in the mornings, bringing back rabbits or grouse for their meals. Violet proved skilled at cooking with limited ingredients, transforming their simple provisions into surprisingly good meals. She also discovered a small garden plot behind the cabin, overgrown but still yielding a few hardy vegetables. In the afternoons, they worked together to repair the cabin's leaky roof and shore up the corral fence. The physical labor was satisfying, giving them both a sense of accomplishment as the cabin became more habitable. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking of their lives before meeting in Green River. Violet spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her love of music fostered by a mother who had once dreamed of being a concert pianist before marriage confined her to society performances. Zach shared carefully edited stories of his years drifting through the West, working odd jobs and moving on whenever the ghosts got too loud. What Zach didn't mention was how he was beginning to look forward to those evening conversations. How Violet's laugh made something long dormant inside him stir to life. How he found himself watching her hands as she worked the same hands that had created such beautiful music in the saloon. On the 4th day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson, Violet broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "Tanner won't give up," she said quietly. "Even if he loses my trail, he'll keep searching. My father's money ensures that." Zach nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. "We should move on soon. This place is secure, but we can't stay forever." "Where would we go?" She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. "I've been thinking about California, San Francisco, perhaps." "It's a big city easy to disappear in." "It's a long journey," Zach warned, "and expensive. The stages charge a small fortune for that route." Violet twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a habit Zach had noticed when she was thinking deeply. "I have an idea about that. My mother's family had a small inheritance set aside for me. It's in a bank in Denver, if I could access that money." "Denver's controlled by your father's interests, isn't it? You'd be walking into a trap." "Not necessarily," she said, warming to her plan. "The account is in my name, not my father's. And Denver is a growing city busy enough that I might go unnoticed if we're careful." Zach frowned, considering the risks. Denver was indeed a busy hub of commerce, but it was also a center for railroad interests. If Horace Mercer had connections there, which seemed likely, Violet would be in danger. "It's too risky," he decided. "We'll find another way." Violet's expression hardened slightly. "Zach, I appreciate your concern, but this is my decision." I can't keep running forever, and I can't expect you to keep protecting me. That money would give me options, real options for building a new life." Her words stung more than Zach wanted to admit. Of course she was right, they couldn't continue as they were. He had no claim on her, no right to dictate her choices. Yet the thought of her walking into Denver, possibly into Tanner's waiting arms, made his chest tighten with an emotion he refused to name. "At least let me come with you," he said finally. "I know Denver. I can help you navigate the city safely." The tension in Violet's shoulders eased. "Thank you, that's all I'm asking." They fell silent again, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, the sound echoing off the cliffs. "What will you do, Zach?" Violet asked softly. "After Denver, I mean." The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on keeping Violet safe that he hadn't considered what would come after. The thought of returning to his solitary existence, drifting from job to job with only his ghosts for company, suddenly seemed bleaker than before. "I don't know," he admitted. "Keep moving, I suppose." Violet studied his face in the fading light. "You could stop running too, you know." "The war has been over for 6 years. Whatever you did then, it's not that simple," Zach interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "Isn't it?" She held his gaze steadily. "You told me that people run towards something as well as away from something." "What are you running toward, Zachariah Prescott?" Before he could answer, a sound from the forest edge caught their attention. Zach was on his feet instantly, Remington in hand. "Inside," he said tersely. "Now." Violet didn't argue, slipping through the cabin door as Zach took position on the porch, scanning the tree line. For several long minutes, nothing moved. Then, at the edge of the clearing, a deer emerged cautiously, pausing to graze on the tender grass. Zach relaxed slightly but remained vigilant. Animals often sensed human presence before it was visible. If Tanner and his men were nearby, the wildlife would be the first to know. But the deer continued to graze peacefully, eventually joined by a fawn on spindly legs. As darkness deepened, they wandered back into the forest undisturbed. Inside the cabin, Violet had lit the lamps and was adding wood to the fire. "False alarm?" she asked. "Seems so," Zach replied, bolting the door behind him. "But we should take turns keeping watch tonight." They ate dinner in relative silence, the easy companionship of earlier in the day replaced by a subtle tension. Violet's question hung between them, unanswered. As they prepared for sleep, Zach insisted that Violet take the bed while he made a pallet on the floor near the door. She protested, but he was firm. "I'll wake you for the second watch," he said, checking his Remington one last time before stretching out on his bedroll. The cabin grew quiet except for the occasional pop and crackle of the fire. Outside, an owl called, answered by its mate in the distance. "Zach." Violet's voice came softly from the darkness. "Mm? I'm sorry if I pushed too hard earlier. Your past is your business." He stared at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. "It's not that, it's just the things I did during the war, they're not easy to talk about or to forget." "I understand," she said gently. "But everyone deserves a second chance, even you." Her words followed him into an uneasy sleep, where dreams of battlefields mingled with images of Violet playing the piano in a sunlit room he'd never seen. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They resumed their routine, Zach hunting, Violet tending the small garden and preparing meals, but something had shifted between them. A new awareness, perhaps, or a deepening of the connection that had been building since Green River. In the afternoon, they rode together to check the perimeter of the valley, alert for any signs of intrusion. The forest was peaceful, showing no evidence of human visitors. "It's beautiful here," Violet commented as they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. The cabin below looked tiny against the backdrop of towering cliffs. "I can see why you return," Zach nodded. "Mackie chose the spot well, hidden but habitable, good hunting, clean water, enough flat land for a small garden. You could make a real home of it," she observed, "with some work." The suggestion startled him. He'd never thought of Mackie's cabin as a permanent home, just a place to weather the worst of winter before moving on again. But Violet was right. With effort, it could be more than a temporary shelter. Maybe, he allowed. Someday. They returned to the cabin as the sun began its descent behind the western cliffs. The evening routine felt comfortable now, Violet cooking while Zach tended to the horses, then sharing the meal at the rough table by lamplight. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Violet suddenly asked, "Will you tell me about your worst day in the war, the thing that haunts you most?" Zach stiffened, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. "Why would you want to hear about that?" "Because whatever it is, it's the thing that keeps you running," she said simply. "And sometimes naming the demons makes them less powerful." He stared into the fire, considering her request. No one had ever asked him directly about his war experiences. Most people in the West either had their own ghosts to contend with or knew better than to pry. But Violet's question didn't feel intrusive. It felt like a genuine attempt to understand. "Gettysburg," he said finally. "July 1863. I was positioned on Seminary Ridge with orders to target Union officers during Pickett's charge." Violet listened silently as he described that terrible day, the thunderous artillery barrage that preceded the charge, the sight of thousands of Confederate soldiers emerging from the woods to march across the open field toward the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. "I had a clear line of sight to the Union artillery," Zach continued, his voice low. "My job was to pick off their officers, create confusion, maybe open a gap for our infantry to exploit." He described the methodical way he'd worked, selecting targets, controlling his breathing, squeezing the trigger. The distance had been extreme, over half a mile, but he'd been one of the Confederacy's best marksmen. "The last man I shot that day was young, couldn't have been more than 20. Blonde hair, Lieutenant's bars. He was rallying his men after their captain fell." Zach's voice grew hoarse. "I watched him through my scope for maybe 30 seconds, saw him smile at something one of his men said, then I killed him. Clean shot, center of the chest. He never knew what hit him." The fire popped and hissed in the silence that followed. "Later, after Pickett's charge failed and we were retreating, I came across a Union soldier dying in a field hospital. He was delirious, calling for his brother. Said they'd enlisted together, served in the same unit. His brother was a lieutenant who'd been killed by a sharpshooter that morning." Zach set his coffee cup down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "I sat with that boy while he died, knowing I'd killed his brother hours earlier. He thanked me for staying with him." He laughed bitterly. "Can you imagine that? Thanking his brother's killer?" Violet reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers were warm against his cold ones. "War makes murderers of good men," she said quietly. "But it doesn't define who you are now, doesn't it?" Zach pulled his hand away. "I've killed men since the war, Violet. Men like Tanner's friend in the saloon. It comes too easily to me." "You killed to protect me," she countered. "There's a difference between killing for necessity and killing for pleasure or profit. You're not a murderer, Zach." He wanted to believe her. Wanted to see himself through her eyes as someone worthy of redemption, but the ghosts were too loud, the blood on his hands too abundant. "We should get some rest," he said, standing abruptly. "If we're heading to Denver, we have preparations to make." Violet looked like she wanted to say more, but she nodded and rose as well. "Good night, Zach." After she had settled into the bed, Zach stepped outside onto the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the black sky like diamond dust. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke drift upward to mingle with the stars. Violet's question echoed in his mind. "What are you running toward, Zachariah Prescott?" For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by his past. A future that might include a home, a purpose, perhaps even companionship. The thought was as terrifying as it was alluring. Inside the cabin, he could hear Violet's soft, regular breathing. In the short time they'd known each other, she had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. Her courage in facing her own demons had forced him to confront his. Zach crushed out his cigarette and returned inside, securing the door behind him. He lay down on his bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the cabin, the settling logs, the dying fire, Violet's quiet breathing. Tomorrow they would begin planning their journey to Denver. It would be dangerous, but they would face it together. And afterward, perhaps there would be time to answer Violet's question properly. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Zach fell asleep thinking of the future rather than the past. The journey to Denver took nearly 2 weeks. They traveled cautiously, avoiding main trails and settlements where news of a reward for Violet might have spread. Zach led them through back country he knew from his years of drifting, relying on game and the occasional friendly homesteader for sustenance. As they rode, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. The shared hardships of the trail, sudden summer storms, difficult river crossings, and the constant vigilance against pursuit forged a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. Violet proved herself repeatedly to be resilient and resourceful. When Zach's stallion threw a shoe in a remote mountain pass, she helped him fashion a temporary replacement from materials in their saddlebags. When they encountered a family of settlers with a sick child, Violet's knowledge of herbal remedies learned from her mother provided relief until the local doctor could arrive. For his part, Zach found himself opening up more about his past, not just the dark chapters of the war, but the lighter moments of his childhood in Virginia and his adventures in the years since. He discovered that making Violet laugh gave him a satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. By the time the sprawling buildings of Denver appeared on the horizon, Zach realized with sudden clarity that he didn't want their journey to end. The thought of Violet continuing to California alone left him with an emptiness he wasn't prepared to face. They made camp for the final night a few miles outside the city, within sight of the distant lights but hidden in a grove of cottonwoods along the South Platte River. "We'll enter the city tomorrow morning," Zach said as they sat beside their small fire. "The bank opens at 9. We should be in and out quickly, then back on the trail by noon." Violet nodded, her expression thoughtful as she gazed toward the city lights. "And then what? After I have the money?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. "That depends on you," Zach said carefully. "California is still an option, or," he hesitated, then plunged ahead, "you could come back to the cabin with me, at least for a while, until we're sure Tanner has given up the chase." Violet's eyes met his across the fire, surprise and something warmer in their depths. "Are you asking me to stay with you, Zachariah Prescott?" "I'm suggesting it might be safer," he replied, though they both knew safety wasn't his only motivation. "The cabin is remote, defensible. We've seen no sign of pursuit since we left. And if Tanner never gives up," her voice was soft. "Would you have me stay indefinitely?" Zach found himself at a crossroads. The careful distance he'd maintained for years from people, from attachments, from the possibility of loss was crumbling in the face of his growing feelings for Violet. The sensible course would be to help her access her money, see her safely on a stage to California, and return to his solitary existence. But nothing about Violet Mercer had been sensible from the moment he'd seen her in the Green River Saloon. "I would have you stay as long as you wanted," he admitted. "The cabin could use a woman's touch." A smile spread across Violet's face, transforming it in the firelight. "Is that your way of saying you'd miss me if I went to California?" "Maybe," he conceded, returning her smile with a small one of his own. "Though God knows why. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," Violet laughed, the sound bright in the quiet night. High praise coming from a man who defines obstinacy. Their banter continued as they prepared for sleep, the tension of the approaching city temporarily set aside. That night, for the first time since leaving the cabin, Zach slept deeply and without dreams. They rode into Denver shortly after dawn, when the streets were beginning to fill with workers and merchants starting their day. The city had grown significantly since Zach's last visit. New buildings of brick and stone rose alongside the original wooden structures, and the railroad depot bustled with activity. Violet had dressed in her most respectable attire, a dark blue traveling dress with a high collar and modest bustle. With her hair neatly arranged under a small hat, she looked every inch the proper Eastern lady. Zach had likewise cleaned up as best he could, though his trail-worn clothes and the Remington at his hip marked him clearly as a frontiersman. "The bank is on Larimer Street," Violet said as they tethered their horses in front of a hotel. "We should secure rooms first, in case we need to stay overnight." Zach nodded, though the thought of spending a night in the city made him uneasy. They were more vulnerable here than they had been on the trail. The hotel clerk eyed them curiously. As they requested separate rooms, a respectable lady and her trail-worn escort were an unusual combination, but Denver was a frontier city accustomed to unusual sights, and money spoke louder than propriety. Once their bags were secured in their rooms, they set out for the bank. Denver's First National Bank occupied an impressive building of red sandstone, its facade adorned with classical columns and large windows. Inside, the marble floor and polished wood counters spoke of prosperity and permanence. Violet approached the teller with confidence, requesting a meeting with the bank manager regarding her account. While they waited, Zach positioned himself near the entrance, eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. The manager, a portly man named Whitaker with mutton chop whiskers and gold spectacles, greeted Violet with professional courtesy. His expression changed to one of surprise when she presented her identification and account details. "Miss Mercer," he said, glancing from the papers to her face. "I must say your arrival is unexpected. We received inquiries about this account just last week." Zach tensed, his hand moving closer to his Remington. "What kind of inquiries?" Whitaker blinked at the interruption. "A gentleman representing Horace Mercer inquired about recent activity on the account. Of course, we informed him that banking privacy prevented us from disclosing such information without proper authorization." Violet's face had paled slightly. "Did this gentleman leave a name?" "A Mr. Tanner, I believe." Whitaker shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Yes, Edward Tanner. He indicated he was acting on Mr. Mercer's behalf regarding family matters." Zach and Violet exchanged glances. Tanner was still pursuing them, and he was closer than they'd thought. "Mr. Whitaker," Violet said firmly, "I wish to withdraw the entire balance of my account immediately, in cash if possible." The manager's eyebrows rose. "The entire amount? That's a considerable sum, Miss Mercer, over $2,000. I'm not sure we can accommodate such a large cash withdrawal without notice." "Then bank drafts will suffice for part of it," she replied, "but I must insist on completing this transaction today." Whitaker hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps if you could explain the urgency. The funds are legally mine," Violet interrupted, her voice cool and authoritative, the voice of a woman raised in wealth and privilege. "Inherited from my mother's estate and placed in trust until my 21st birthday, which was 2 years ago. I am not required to explain my financial decisions to you or anyone else, Mr. Whitaker." The manager's resistance crumbled under her composed determination. "Of course, Miss Mercer, I'll arrange it immediately." While Whitaker was occupied with the transaction, Zach moved closer to Violet. "We need to leave Denver as soon as the withdrawal is complete," he murmured. "If Tanner's been here, he might still be in the city." She nodded, her face tense. "Or he may have left men watching the bank." The transaction took nearly an hour to complete. Whitaker returned with several bank drafts and a significant amount of cash, all of which Violet carefully stowed in her reticule and a small valise she'd brought for the purpose. As they prepared to leave the bank, Zach's instincts flared. "Wait," he said quietly, pulling Violet back from the entrance. Through the large windows, he could see 2 men loitering across the street, their attention focused on the bank's doors. "Is there another exit?" he asked Whitaker, who had accompanied them to the lobby. The manager looked startled but nodded. "Through my office. It leads to an alley behind the building." "We'll use that," Zach decided. "Thank you for your assistance." Whitaker led them back through the bank to his office and unlocked a door that opened into a narrow alley. "May I ask," he began, but Zach cut him off. "Better that you don't know, sir, for your own safety." They slipped into the alley and moved quickly away from the bank, keeping to side streets and avoiding the main thoroughfares. Zach led them on a circuitous route back toward their hotel, alert for any sign of pursuit. "We'll need to leave our horses," he said as they approached the hotel from the rear. "They're too recognizable and Tanner's men may already be watching them. But how will we leave the city?" Violet asked, clutching her valise tightly. "The railroad," Zach decided. "There's a westbound train leaving for Cheyenne this afternoon. From there, we can buy horses and supplies, then cut back south toward the cabin." They retrieved only what was essential from their hotel rooms, abandoning most of their belongings. Zach felt a pang at leaving his stallion behind. The horse had been a loyal companion for years, but their safety was more important. He left instructions and payment with the stable master for the care of both horses. The Denver Pacific Depot was crowded when they arrived, passengers and freight being loaded for the afternoon departure to Cheyenne. Zach purchased tickets while Violet waited in the ladies' waiting room, her hat pulled low over her face. As the train whistle blew its first warning, Zach escorted Violet quickly to their car, choosing seats on the side away from the platform. The second whistle sounded, and the train began to move with a jerk and the hiss of steam. They were pulling out of the station when Zach spotted them, Tanner and 3 men, pushing through the crowd on the platform, scanning the train windows. Violet saw them too and shrank back into her seat. "They're too late," Zach said, watching as the platform and the searching men receded into the distance. "We're clear." Violet's shoulders sagged with relief. "For now, but they'll follow us to Cheyenne." "Probably," Zach agreed. "But we'll have a head start, and once we're in the back country, they'll have a hard time picking up our trail." The train clattered northward through the Colorado Territory, leaving Denver and its dangers behind. As the tension of the day began to ease, Violet opened her valise to show Zach its contents. $2,342, she said quietly. "My mother's legacy. She always said it was my key to independence if I ever needed it." Zach whistled softly. It was more money than he'd seen in one place since before the war. "Your mother was a wise woman." "Yes," Violet agreed, a sad smile touching her lips. "She understood what it meant to be trapped. She didn't want that for me." She closed the valise and met Zach's eyes. "I've made a decision. If the offer still stands, I'd like to return to the cabin with you, at least until we're sure it's safe." Something warm unfurled in Zach's chest. "The offer stands." The journey from Cheyenne back to the Hidden Valley was arduous but uneventful. They purchased horses, supplies, and weapons, then struck out southward, avoiding the main trails and settlements. Violet insisted on buying a small arsenal, a Winchester rifle for herself, and extra ammunition for both of them. "I intend to learn to shoot properly," she declared when Zach raised an eyebrow at her purchases. "I won't be helpless if Tanner finds us again." True to her word, she practiced diligently during their journey, improving rapidly under Zach's tutelage. By the time they reached the familiar slopes leading down to the cabin, she could hit a stationary target consistently at 50 yards, not expert marksmanship, but enough to defend herself if necessary. The cabin was undisturbed when they arrived, exactly as they had left it weeks earlier. As Zach built a fire in the hearth and Violet unpacked their supplies, there was a strange sense of homecoming that neither had anticipated. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Violet turned to Zach with a determined expression. "I want to make some changes," she announced. "If I'm going to stay here, even temporarily, I want to make this place more livable." Zach looked amused. "What did you have in mind?" "Glass for the windows, for one thing," she replied promptly. "Proper furniture. a larger garden. Maybe even some livestock chickens at least. She hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind, that is, it is your cabin." "Our cabin," Zach corrected before he could stop himself, "for as long as you stay." The smile she gave him then was worth every hardship they'd endured to reach this moment. Over the following weeks, they transformed the trapper's simple shelter into a real home. Zach rode to the trading post and returned with glass panes for the windows, fabric for curtains, proper dishes and cookware, and seeds for the expanded garden. Violet's money made improvements possible that Zach would never have considered on his own. They fell into a rhythm of shared work and companionship. Zach taught Violet to hunt and track. She taught him to cook dishes more complex than trail stew. In the evenings, they read aloud from books Zach brought from the trading post, mostly dime novels and newspapers, but occasionally something more substantial. As summer gave way to autumn, the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold and the nights grew cooler. They worked together to lay in provisions for winter smoking meat, preserving garden produce, cutting and stacking firewood. One crisp October morning, as they worked side by side splitting logs for the woodpile, Zach paused, leaning on his axe as he watched Violet arrange the split wood in neat rows. Her copper hair was tied back with a faded ribbon, her cheeks flushed with exertion and the cold air. She had changed in the months since Green River, her hands now calloused from work, her body stronger and more at ease in the wilderness. But the most profound change was in her eyes. The hunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. Here in this hidden valley, she had found something she'd been seeking since fleeing St. Louis, freedom to define herself on her own terms. Zach realized he had changed too. The ghosts still visited his dreams occasionally, but they were less insistent now, less accusing. Working alongside Violet, building something instead of destroying, had begun to balance the scales that had been weighted with guilt for so long. "What are you staring at?" Violet asked, catching his gaze. "You," he admitted simply. She straightened, brushing wood chips from her skirt. "And what do you see?" "A woman who belongs here," Zach said. "In this valley, in this life." A smile spread across her face, warming him more thoroughly than any fire could have. "I was thinking the same about you," she replied. "You've stopped looking over your shoulder all the time. You're present now in a way you weren't before." It was true, Zach realized. Somewhere along their journey, he had stopped running from his past and started building a future. A future that, increasingly, he couldn't imagine without Violet in it. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Zach cleared his throat awkwardly. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he said. "Winter's coming. Once the snow falls, we'll be isolated here until spring." Violet nodded. "I know, I've been preparing for it. What I mean is..." Zach fumbled for words, unused to expressing feelings he'd kept buried for so long. "You have options now. With your money, you could go anywhere once the pass is clear in spring, California, Oregon, even back east if you wanted." She set down her mending and looked at him steadily. "Is that what you want? For me to leave in spring?" "No," he said, the word rough with emotion. "God help me, that's the last thing I want. But I need you to know that you're free to go. I won't hold you here out of some misplaced sense of obligation or gratitude." Violet rose from her chair and came to kneel beside him, taking his hands in hers. "Zachariah Prescott, are you trying to drive me away or ask me to stay?" "Both, maybe," he admitted with a rueful smile. "I'm not good at this." "Then let me make it simple," she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that night in Green River when you stood up for a stranger against 3 armed men. I've only fallen deeper since then." "So unless you're telling me you don't feel the same way," he cut her off by pulling her into his arms and kissing her. It was a kiss that had been building for months, through dangers faced together and quiet evenings by the fire. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said softly. "I think I've loved you since I heard you play that piano, but I didn't think I deserved someone like you, not with my past." Violet's hand came up to cup his cheek. Your past is part of who you are, Zach. The good and the bad. I love all of it because it made you the man who would risk everything to help a woman he didn't know. The man who taught me to shoot and hunt and survive. The man who gave me a home when I had none. In that moment, the last of Zach's reservations fell away. The ghosts that had haunted him for so long seemed to recede into the shadows, making room for something he'd thought he'd never have again hope for the future. They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit-riding preacher who stopped at the trading post. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by the post's proprietor and his wife. Violet wore a dress of deep blue, the only good dress she'd brought from her former life, and Zach wore the one clean shirt he owned, freshly pressed for the occasion. As winter settled over the hidden valley, blanketing the cabin in snow and sealing them away from the outside world, they found that isolation suited them. The months passed in a rhythm of daily tasks, quiet evenings by the fire, and nights spent in each other's arms. They talked of the future of expanding the cabin in spring, of perhaps building a proper ranch if Tanner's pursuit ever truly ended. Violet spoke of starting a small school for the children of distant homesteaders who had little access to education. Zach considered raising horses, using his knowledge of bloodlines from his Virginia upbringing. When spring finally arrived, bringing wildflowers to the valley and melting the snow from the mountain passes, they made their first journey to the trading post together since winter began. The proprietor greeted them warmly, handing over months of accumulated mail and the latest newspapers. Among the papers was a notice that caught Zach's eye. He read it silently, then passed it to Violet without comment. Railroad magnate's tragic end. Horace Mercer, prominent saint. Louis, businessman and railroad investor, was found dead in his office last month, the victim of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. Sources close to the family report that Mercer had suffered significant financial reversals following the collapse of a planned rail expansion into Montana territory. His business partner, Edward Tanner, has assumed control of Mercer's remaining assets, though legal challenges from other creditors are expected. Mercer is survived by a daughter, Violet, whose whereabouts remain unknown. Violet read the notice twice, her face pale but composed. So my father is gone, she said quietly. And Tanner has what he always wanted, control of the railroad interests. Zach watched her carefully. Are you all right? She nodded slowly. I mourned my father years ago when I realized he saw me only as property to be traded. This is just formal confirmation of what was already lost. She folded the newspaper and handed it back. What do you think it means for us? Will Tanner continue searching for me? Hard to say, Zach replied truthfully. He strikes me as a man who doesn't like to lose. But with your father gone and the railroad in his hands, his primary motivation is removed. It might depend on how much his pride was wounded. They rode home in thoughtful silence, each considering the implications of this news. As they crested the ridge overlooking their valley, they paused to take in the view the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the expanded garden plot ready for spring planting, the small corral where their horses and the 2 milk cows they'd acquired grazed peacefully. It's beautiful, Violet said, her face softening as she gazed at their home. More beautiful than any mansion in St. Louis could ever be. Zach reached across to take her hand. If Tanner comes, we'll face him together, but my guess is he's moved on to other conquests. Men like that always need new worlds to dominate. Violet squeezed his hand. I have something to tell you, she said, a smile spreading across her face. I was waiting for the right moment, and this seems like it might be it. Zach raised an eyebrow questioningly. I'm with child, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Due in late autumn by my calculation. Joy spread through Zach like wildfire, momentarily robbing him of speech. He dismounted quickly and helped Violet down from her horse, pulling her into a gentle embrace. A child, he repeated, wonder in his voice. Our child. The future that had once seemed impossibly out of reach now stretched before them, full of promise and new beginnings. In this hidden valley, far from the ghosts of Virginia battlefields and St. Louis drawing rooms, they had found what both had been searching for: not just escape from their pasts, but a chance to build something meaningful together. As they rode down into the valley, toward the home they had created, Zach thought of the long, winding trail that had led him to this moment. From a sharpshooter haunted by the men he'd killed to a husband and soon-to-be father, defending a life he cherished rather than dealing in death. "What are you thinking?" Violet asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "That sometimes," he replied, "what you're running toward is more important than what you're running from." She smiled, understanding perfectly. "And we're not running anymore, are we?" "No," Zach agreed, gazing at the cabin that had become their sanctuary. "We're finally home." In the years that followed, the hidden valley witnessed the growth of both the land and the family that tended it. Violet gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after Zach's father, followed 2 years later by a daughter named Elizabeth, for Violet's mother. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with new rooms added as needed, and the original structure renovated into a comfortable home. Word of Zach's skill with horses spread through the territory, bringing buyers from as far as Denver to purchase his carefully bred stock. Violet's small school, begun with just 3 students from neighboring homesteads, grew to accommodate a dozen children who traveled from miles around for lessons. Edward Tanner never reappeared in their lives. They heard occasionally of his business ventures through newspapers or travelers passing through railroad expansions, mining investments, political ambitions. But the man himself became a distant figure from their past, his threat fading with each passing season. 10 years after they had first fled Green River together, Zach and Violet stood on the porch of their ranch house, for the cabin had long since evolved into a proper home, watching their children play in the summer twilight. Thomas, at 9, was already showing his father's quiet determination and skill with horses. 7-year-old Elizabeth had inherited her mother's copper hair and love of music, practicing diligently on the piano Zach had surprised Violet with on their 5th anniversary. "You ever regret it?" Zach asked suddenly. Choosing this life instead of returning to civilization, Violet leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Never," she said simply. "Everything I need is right here." As darkness settled over the hidden valley, and they called the children in for supper, Zach reflected on the strange twist of fate that had led him to that Green River saloon on the precise night when a defiant woman had needed his help. How easily it might have gone differently if he'd chosen another town, another saloon, another path entirely. But he hadn't, and that single decision had altered the course of both their lives. 2 broken people, running from their separate demons, had somehow found redemption in each other's arms and in the life they'd built together. It wasn't always easy. The ghost still visited occasionally, though less frequently with each passing year. There were hard winters and failed crops, injuries and illnesses, the 1,000 challenges that frontier life presented. But they faced each one together, their bond only strengthening through adversity. And on quiet evenings like this, with his family safe under their roof and the future stretching bright before them, Zachariah Prescott knew with absolute certainty that he had finally outrun his past. In helping Violet escape her cage, he had found the key to his own. Together, they had transformed their scars into something beautiful, a love story written not in spite of their wounds, but because of them.